the much-anticipated phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin has ended. The conversation lasted 2.5 hours, and we now have a mix of good news and bad news. Let's start with the bad news. Putin has once again rejected the ceasefire. This isn't the first time, and it probably won't be the last. His conditions? Almost impossible for Ukraine to accept. He demanded that Ukraine must stop mobilizing soldiers. Ukraine must stop training its troops. Ukraine must stop receiving any foreign military aid. Basically, Russia wants Ukraine to stand defenseless while it continues its invasion. This is not a ceasefire. This is a surrender demand. The U.S. has already made it clear these conditions are unacceptable. But there's also a surprising twist. Putin did agree to stop attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure for the next 30 days. This might sound like a positive step, but here's the irony. Just weeks ago, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov claimed that Russia had never targeted Ukraine's energy grid. And now, Putin himself is admitting that was a lie. He's saying Russia will stop attacking energy facilities. But wait, if Russia was never attacking them, why does he need to stop? This contradiction just exposed Russia's propaganda in real time. So, what's really going on? Why did Putin even agree to this small concession? Is this a strategic move, or is Russia feeling the pressure? And most importantly, what was Trump's response? Let's break it all down. The moment the Trump-Putin call ended, both Washington and Moscow scrambled to shape the narrative. But their stories? Completely different. The Kremlin was the first to release its version. According to them, the call was a sincere discussion about the future of U.S. Russia relations. They made it sound like both leaders were working together for global peace. But let's look at what Russia actually claimed. First, they announced a prisoner exchange. 175 Russian prisoners for 175 Ukrainian captives. Then, they talked about creating expert groups to regulate the Ukraine situation, though what that actually means is still unclear. And of course, they highlighted Putin's 30-day pause on energy infrastructure attacks, trying to make it seem like a major peace gesture. But then, out of nowhere, Putin brought up hockey. Yes, you heard that right. In the middle of discussing war, peace, and nuclear threats, he suggested a friendly hockey game between NHL players and Russia's league. Why? Maybe to shift focus away from the war. Maybe to show that Russia isn't as isolated as the world thinks. Or maybe he just wanted a distraction. But then came the White House readout, and their version had a completely different tone. Instead of talking about friendship and cooperation, the U.S. made one thing clear. This war should have never started. According to them, the call was about pushing for real peace and a ceasefire. The U.S. did acknowledge the 30-day ceasefire on energy infrastructure, but they didn't celebrate it as a breakthrough. To them, this was just a small step in a much bigger conflict. The real focus was on negotiations in the Middle East, talks that are supposed to start immediately. But here's where things got really interesting. Trump and Putin apparently agreed that Iran should never be in a position to threaten Israel. That's a huge deal. Russia has always had close ties with Iran. So why is Putin suddenly aligning with the U.S. on this? Was he trying to win favor with Trump? Or is Russia quietly shifting its alliances? At the end of the day, both sides claimed progress. But the real question remains. Was this actually a step toward peace, or just another political game? While the world focuses on Russia and the U.S., Turkey has made its stance loud and clear. Ukraine's sovereignty is not up for debate. Unlike some nations trying to stay neutral, Turkey has stood firm. Crimea belongs to Ukraine. Period. This isn't a new position. Since Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, Turkey has refused to recognize it as Russian territory. And recently, on the anniversary of Russia's so-called referendum, Turkey doubled down, releasing a strong statement rejecting Moscow's claims. But this isn't just about diplomacy. There's history behind Turkey's stand. Crimea is home to the Crimean Tatars, a Turkic ethnic group with deep historical ties to Turkey. For centuries they lived in Crimea, until Russia took over and began oppressing them. Forced disappearances, arrests, and persecution became their new reality. Turkey sees this as an attack on its own people, which is why they have consistently called Russia's occupation illegal and unacceptable. But let's talk about the referendum Russia keeps using to justify its control over Crimea. Was it really a vote, or just a staged event? The truth is disturbing. When Crimeans walked into polling stations, they found themselves surrounded by armed Russian soldiers. The so-called vote had only two options: join Russia immediately or become an independent state that Russia would still control. There was no option to stay with Ukraine. In other words, it wasn't democracy. It was a forced takeover. And here's where things get really interesting. Putin himself once said that Crimea belonged to Ukraine. Back in 1999, before he became president, he warned that if Russia ever started changing borders in the former Soviet Union, it would only lead to disaster. He said Russia did not want Crimea, and that taking it would create problems that Moscow might never recover from. Fast forward to today, and he's doing exactly what he once warned against. So, what changed? Power. When Putin was just a politician, he had no empire-building ambitions. But once he got absolute control, he rewrote history at Ukraine's expense. Turkey isn't buying into it. And as the war drags on, Ankara's message is clear. Crimea is Ukraine. It always was, and it always will be. As the war drags on, Europe is getting impatient. Some countries, especially the UK and France, believe that if diplomacy isn't working, it's time to take action. That's why they are now considering something Russia absolutely hates: sending European peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. The idea is simple. Deploy peacekeepers to stabilize the region, enforce ceasefires, and prevent further Russian advances. But Russia sees this as a direct threat. They've already warned that if any NATO troops enter Ukraine, it could lead to a full-scale war. Their message is clear. Peacekeepers are only acceptable if Russia chooses who they are. And here's where the contradiction begins. Russia keeps saying that it doesn't want NATO troops in Ukraine. But when Australia, a non-NATO country, offered to send peacekeepers, Russia still said no. Meanwhile, Moscow has no problem bringing in Chinese and North Korean troops to fight on its side. So the real issue isn't NATO, it's control. Russia doesn't want peacekeepers. It wants to dictate the terms of war. But what about Trump? His stance on Ukraine has always been unpredictable. But when asked about European peacekeeping troops, he didn't oppose the idea. In fact, he suggested that if Europe wanted to send peacekeepers, he wouldn't stand in the way. This is a major shift, because if Trump supports the idea, it could gain momentum. And if Europe pushes forward with peacekeeping plans, Russia will be forced to respond. So, what happens next? Will European troops actually enter Ukraine, or is this just political posturing? If they do, will Russia escalate further? One thing is certain. The battlefield is no longer just in Ukraine. It's now a global power struggle. Something big just happened in Moscow's elite district. Just 7 miles from the Kremlin, a powerful explosion shook a high-end apartment complex. The target? Armen Sas, the founder of the Armenian Battalion, a Russian paramilitary group fighting in Ukraine. This wasn't some random attack. This was an assassination. According to reports, an anti-personnel mine was used, a brutal method designed to ensure maximum damage in a small space. Witnesses say the attacker was waiting in the lobby, sitting calmly with a briefcase, pretending to read a newspaper. The moment Sas walked past, boom! The explosion tore through the room, killing him instantly. Now, here's the real question. Who was behind it? Many were quick to point fingers at Ukraine, but there's another possibility. This could have been an inside job. Russia has a long history of eliminating its own people when they become liabilities. And with tensions rising inside Moscow, more and more of Putin's inner circle is being targeted. And this wasn't the only attack. Around the same time, a Russian oil tanker, part of Putin's shadow fleet, was mysteriously damaged in a separate incident. This raises an even bigger question. Is Russia starting to crumble from within? Whether this was Ukraine or internal enemies, one thing is clear. Nowhere is safe for Putin's allies anymore. Even in the heart of Moscow, the war is closing in. Something strange is happening inside Russia. While the Kremlin continues its war against Ukraine, more and more Russians are secretly fighting back against their own government. Reports are emerging of Russian citizens helping Ukraine, not with weapons, but with information, sabotage, and silent resistance. Train lines carrying military supplies are being derailed. Fuel depots are catching fire. Communication lines are mysteriously going down. It's happening too often to be a coincidence. Someone, or a lot of people, are working from the inside to weaken Putin's war machine. And the Kremlin knows it. Russian state TV has now started airing warning advertisements, telling citizens that anyone caught helping Ukraine will be found, arrested, and jailed for up to 10 years. They're calling these people traitors. But let's be real. This is fear. The Russian government is terrified that its own people are turning against it. This war isn't just being fought on the front lines anymore. It's inside Russia now. And as the economy crumbles and Putin's grip weakens, one thing is becoming clear. His biggest enemy might not be Ukraine. It might be his own people. On the battlefield, Ukraine is resisting. But behind the scenes, Russia is bleeding economically. The war isn't just costing lives, it's draining Russia's future. Western sanctions have crippled its ability to trade, cutting off billions in revenue. Key industries are collapsing. Foreign investors have fled. And now, even Russia's closest allies are stepping back. For years, China was seen as Russia's financial safety net. But now, Beijing is quietly reducing oil imports. Instead of relying on Russian energy, China is diversifying its suppliers, securing deals with the Middle East and even Venezuela. India, another major buyer, is also negotiating lower prices, squeezing Russia's profits further. The message is clear. Even Russia's so-called partners are prioritizing their own interests over loyalty to Moscow. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the economic pain is undeniable. The ruble is collapsing, inflation is spiraling, and ordinary citizens are struggling to afford basic goods. Supermarket shelves are emptier, and companies are shutting down as supply chains break. Millions of Russians who once ignored the war are now feeling its consequences firsthand. And then there's the brain drain. Since the war began, hundreds of thousands of young, educated Russians have fled the country. Engineers, scientists, and IT specialists, the people who were supposed to build Russia's future, are now working in Europe, the U.S., and even Ukraine. Many of them left not just to escape military drafts, but because they saw no future under Putin's rule. This isn't just an economic setback, it's a generational collapse. Putin knows this. That's why he's becoming desperate to force peace on his terms. But with Ukraine still standing, Western aid still flowing, and his own country crumbling from within, he's running out of time. For over 2 decades, Putin has ruled Russia with an iron fist. He's crushed opposition, silenced critics, and built an image of absolute control. But now, the cracks are impossible to ignore. Inside Moscow, high-profile assassinations are becoming alarmingly frequent. Once powerful military generals are turning up dead. Russian officials are mysteriously disappearing. These aren't random incidents. This is paranoia at the highest level. The very people who helped Putin stay in power are now becoming his biggest threats. The war in Ukraine isn't just about 2 countries anymore. It's a global power struggle, with the U.S., Russia, Europe, and even Turkey playing their own games. Putin refuses to back down. European nations are stepping up. Internal resistance inside Russia is growing. And with high-profile assassinations happening right in Moscow, nowhere is safe anymore. So, what happens next? Will peace talks move forward? Or is this just another delay before the next big escalation? Will European peacekeepers actually enter Ukraine? Or will Russia make a move before that happens? And the biggest question, is Putin losing control of his own country? One thing is clear. This war is far from over. If you want to stay ahead of every major update, make sure to subscribe. We break down the truth behind the headlines so you don't have to. And if you want to support independent reporting, consider becoming a channel member. Your support helps us keep making these deep dives into global events. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.